The stars had no sound. That was the first thing every sailor learned when they left Earth behind. No wind, no waves, just the deep, endless nothing that stretched in every direction, cold and quiet and impossibly old. And somewhere inside that nothing, drifting through the black like a mountain that had learned to move, was the HSS Baekdu. It was not a beautiful ship. No one who looked at it would call it graceful or elegant. It was 19 kilometers of metal and fury, built with the kind of thinking that only came from a species that had spent most of its history trying to kill itself. Humanity had not built the Baekdu to fight aliens. Humanity had built it because it was afraid of what it might do to itself if it ever lost control again. The wars of the 21st and 22nd centuries had taught them something ugly and permanent. That the only thing more dangerous than a human with nothing to lose was a human with everything to protect. And so they built the Titan. Not as a weapon of conquest, but as a promise, a reminder, a fist wrapped around a warning that said, never again. Admiral Park Ji-nu stood on the command bridge with his hands behind his back and his eyes on the stars. He was not a tall man. He was not loud. He did not give speeches, or wave flags, or pound his chest in front of cameras. He was the kind of man who entered a room and you forgot he was there, until the moment things went wrong, and then suddenly he was the only person you can see. His crew respected him, not because he demanded it, but because he had earned it 100 times over, in 100 quiet ways that never made the news. The bridge of the Baekdu was wide and dim, lit mostly by the soft glow of screens and the pale blue light of the forward window. Officers sat at their stations, running checks, monitoring systems, doing the boring and necessary work of keeping a 19-kilometer warship alive in the emptiness between stars. It was a routine patrol. They had done it a dozen times before. Nothing ever happened out here. Until something did. Lieutenant Kang Do-hyun sat at the communications array, a wall of screens and signal processors that could listen to the whispers of the universe from 100 light-years away. He was young, barely past 30, with round glasses and the kind of face that made people think he was still a student. But his mind was sharp, sharper than most, and when his console began to flash with a pattern he had never seen before, his hands moved faster than his thoughts. He ran the signal through 3 filters, then 5, then 12. His face changed. The color left his skin slowly, like water draining from a glass. "Admiral," he said. His voice was steady, but only barely. "I have something." Ji-nu turned from the window. He did not rush. He never rushed. He walked to Do-hyun's station and looked at the screen. The signal was there, repeating, structured, mathematical. It was not natural. It was not noise. It was not an echo or a glitch or a ghost in the system. It was a message. "How long has this been broadcasting?" Ji-nu asked. "I don't know, sir. It could be years, decades. It is repeating on a loop, on frequencies we have never used." Do-hyun swallowed. "Sir, this is not human." The bridge went silent. Not the comfortable silence of routine, but the heavy, breathless silence of a world changing shape. Every officer stopped what they were doing. Every eye turned to the admiral. Ji-nu looked at the signal for a long time. Then he straightened. "All stations, condition 2. Shields up, weapons on standby. No one fires unless I say so." Captain Yoon Hana was already moving before he finished. She was his second in command, a woman with sharp eyes and sharper instincts, the kind of officer who could run a battle from a burning bridge and still have time to fix her hair afterward. She began calling orders across the bridge, and the Baekdu responded like a living thing, systems lighting up, armor plates shifting, the great engines humming deeper as the ship prepared itself for something it had never faced. The doors to the bridge opened, and Dr. Shin Nari rushed in, still pulling on her jacket. She was the head of the Xenoscience Division, a small team of scientists who had spent their entire careers studying the possibility of alien life without ever actually finding any. She was out of breath, and her eyes were wide. "Is it real?" she asked. "The signal. Is it real?" "It is real," Jinu said. Nari pressed her hands together like she was praying. "Admiral, please, give me time. Let my team analyze it before we do anything else. If this is what I think it is, we cannot afford to get our first response wrong." Jinu looked at her, then at Hana, then back at the stars. "1 hour," he said. "Make it count." Nari grabbed Do-hyun by the arm and pulled him to a side console. They worked together in a frenzy of data and sound, pulling the signal apart piece by piece, layer by layer. It was dense, layered. It was broadcasting in thousands of formats at once, as if whoever had sent it wanted to make sure that any species, no matter how primitive, could understand it. It took 47 minutes. When they were finished, Nari's hands were shaking. "It is not a greeting," she said quietly. "It is a warning." She put the translation on the main screen. Every person on the bridge read it at the same time. "You are approaching Sovereign Concord space. Turn back or be judged." The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and toxic and impossible to ignore. Somewhere out there, beyond the dark, something old and powerful had drawn a line in the stars and told the universe to stay behind it. Hana looked at Jinu. "Orders, sir?" The Admiral read the message one more time. Then he looked at his crew, the men and women who had followed him into the black, who had trusted him with their lives, who had left behind families and homes and everything soft and warm to sail a mountain of steel through nothing. "Hold course," he said. Hana blinked. "Sir?" "Hold course, Captain. We do not turn back. Not today, not ever." The Baekdu moved forward. The warning signal grew louder, pulsing, screaming into the void like a siren trying to stop a storm. The ship crossed the invisible line that had kept every other species away for thousands of years. And then they came. They appeared out of nowhere. Dozens of ships, silver and smooth, dropping out of the black like needles falling from the sky. They were beautiful in a terrible way, each one curved and shining and humming with energy that made the Baekdu sensors sing with alarm. They formed a ring around the Titan, a perfect cage, precise, patient, cold. Hana counted them on her screen. 64 ships, sir, all armed, all holding position. Do-hyun shook his head slowly. No transmissions, no hails, nothing. The alien fleet just sat there, watching, waiting, as if they had done this 1,000 times before and already knew how it ended. Jinu stood at the center of his bridge, surrounded by silence and steel, and the weight of a moment that would never come again. They looked back, and the galaxy held its breath. The cage was perfect. 64 ships arranged in a sphere around the Baekdu, each one placed with the kind of precision that spoke of centuries of practice. They did not move. They did not speak. They simply existed. Silver shapes in the dark, holding their positions like statues made of light, and their silence was louder than any weapon. On the Concord flagship, a ship older than most human civilizations, High Arbiter Salon stood before a curved window that stretched from floor to ceiling, and watched the human vessel with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall like seasons. He was tall and thin, his skin the color of pale stone, his features sharp and still, and carved with the kind of authority that came not from strength, but from 12,000 years of never being questioned. "What is it?" he asked. His voice was low, dry, like sand sliding over glass. The officers around him shifted. None of them had a good answer. The ship in the center of their formation was monstrous, a block of dark metal nearly 4 times the size of the largest Concorde warship. It had no elegance, no beauty. It looked like something that had been built by hands that expected to die and decided to take the universe with them. Behind Solon, Observer Killeth stood in the shadows with a data screen in her hands. She was young by Concord standards, barely 300 years old, with wide silver eyes and a mind that had been trained since birth to watch, record, and never interfere. Her job was to observe new species during first contact events, to study them, to measure them, to write the reports that would decide whether they were worth absorbing or erasing. She looked at the human ship and felt something she could not name. Their energy output, she whispered to herself, scrolling through the readings on her screen. It should not be possible. They are generating power equivalent to a Class 4 star. No one heard her. No one was listening. They were all watching Solon. The High Arbiter turned from the window. Send the standard demand. Identification, inspection, and surrender of their commander for judgment. They will comply. They always comply. The message was sent. It crossed the void in seconds and landed on the Baekdu's communication array like a stone thrown through a window. On the bridge, Lieutenant Kang Do-hyun read it 3 times. Then he read it to the Admiral. They want us to identify ourselves, open our ship for their inspection, and hand you over for something they call judgment, Do-hyun said. He paused. That is not a request, sir. The tone is a command. Captain Yoon Hana stood at the tactical console, her fingers resting lightly on the controls. She said nothing, but her jaw was tight and her eyes were hard. Sergeant Bae Tae-sun's voice crackled over the internal comm from the Marine Bay below. Admiral, my people are suited and ready. Just say the word. Dr. Shin Nari stood near the back of the bridge, her arms wrapped around herself. She looked afraid, not of the aliens, but of what might happen next. Admiral Park Jin-woo listened to all of it. He looked at the message on the screen. He looked at his crew. He took a single breath. Then he opened the channel. This is Admiral Park Jin-woo of the Terran warship Baekdu, he said. His voice was calm, clear, and carried no anger and no fear. We are of the species known as humanity. We come from the star system Sol, on the far edge of this galaxy. We did not come here looking for a fight, but we did not come here to kneel either. He paused. We will identify ourselves freely. We will talk freely, but we will not open our ship to your inspection, and I will not surrender myself or any member of my crew for your judgment. That is not how we do things. The message arrived on the Concorde flagship like a crack in a wall that had stood for millennia. Solon stared at the translation on his screen. His officers stared at him. The bridge was so quiet that Kyleth could hear her own heartbeat, fast and strange and wrong. Refused, Solon said, as if the word itself was a disease. It refused. He turned to his fleet commander. Fire a correction. Low intensity. Across their bow. Show this creature what it means to disobey. One of the Concorde warships moved forward, its hull shimmering with gathered energy. It fired a single beam, a bright line of white light that cut across the void and struck the Baekdu's forward shields. On the bridge, the lights flickered for half a second. A soft hum ran through the floor. Then nothing. The shields held without complaint, absorbing the shot like skin absorbing rain. Hana looked at her console, then looked up at Jin-woo. Shields at 99.8%, she said. Her voice was completely flat. They tickled us. Jin-woo did not smile, but something in his eyes shifted, something quiet and dangerous and patient. He turned to Do-hyun. Open a broadcast channel, he said. All frequencies, every language you have decoded. I want every ship in that fleet to hear this. Do-hyun's fingers flew across his console. Channel open, sir. Jin-woo spoke. His voice was the same as before, calm, steady, without anger. But now there was a weight behind it, the kind of weight that came from a man who had already decided what he was willing to lose. That was free, he said. The next one you fire will cost you. The message went out. It reached every ship in the Concorde fleet. It passed through their translators and landed in the minds of officers and soldiers who had served the Concorde for centuries and had never, not once, heard anyone speak to them this way. On the flagship, Solon heard the translation and went still. His officers waited for his response. Kylith held her breath so hard her chest ached. Solon said nothing. For the first time in 400 years, the High Arbiter of the Valith Concord had no words. And the fleet did not fire again. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of shock and confusion, and something that the Concord had not felt since before it was the Concord. It was the silence of a predator that had reached for its prey and found its teeth had not left a mark. Across the galaxy, the moment was already spreading. Concord listening posts, positioned on the edges of every sector, had been recording the encounter in real time. It was standard procedure. Every first contact was documented and archived, but this one was different. This one was already being whispered about on channels that were not supposed to exist. On a mining world 3,000 light-years away, a species that had been under Concord rule for 6,000 years heard the transmission. A worker in a deep tunnel paused, pressed his ear to the speaker on the wall, and listened to the voice of a creature he had never heard of, speaking words that no one had dared to say in living memory. On a diplomatic station in the core of Concord space, ambassadors from a dozen subject species sat in a grand hall and watched the recording play on a massive screen. No one spoke. A diplomat from a species that had not known war in 10,000 years quietly closed his eyes and felt something stir in his chest that he did not have a name for. On the Concord flagship, Keelit stood in her small observation room and watched the human ship on her screen. It sat in the center of the fleet, like a mountain in a field of spears, dark and scarred and impossibly still. She thought about the voice she had heard, the human admiral. He had not screamed. He had not begged. He had not threatened. He had simply spoken the truth as he understood it, and let the universe decide what to do with it. She thought about the Concord's history. 12,000 years of first contacts. Hundreds of species found, tested, and brought to heel. Some had fought. Some had run. Some had wept and surrendered before the first shot was fired. But none of them, not one in 12,000 years, had ever stood still and said no. Kyleth placed her hand on the screen, on the image of the Bekdu, and felt the cold glass against her fingers. "What are you?" she whispered. The ship did not answer. It just sat there in the dark, bleeding light from 1,000 windows, its engines humming a low and patient song, waiting for whatever came next, with the kind of stillness that only something very dangerous or very brave could hold. And the galaxy watched in silence, because it did not know yet whether it was witnessing a beginning or an end. The station floated in the space between the two fleets, like a coin tossed between two hands. It was old, older than anything human eyes had ever seen up close. Its surface was smooth and white, covered in patterns that might have been writing or art, or something that had no human word. Docking lights pulsed along its edges, like a slow heartbeat, guiding the shuttle in. Admiral Park Jinu sat in the back of the shuttle, with his hands resting on his knees. He wore his dress uniform, dark blue with silver at the collar, the only decoration a single pin on his chest that carried the emblem of the Terran fleet. Beside him sat Dr. Shin Nari, who was reviewing her notes on a small screen and trying not to let her hands shake. Across from them sat Captain Yoon Hana, who was checking her sidearm for the third time, even though she had been told no weapons were allowed, and Lieutenant Kang Do-hyun, who was quietly memorizing every alien word he had decoded over the past 48 hours. Back on the Bekdu, Sergeant Bae Tae-sun stood in the command center with his arms crossed and his jaw set. The Admiral had given him one order before leaving: "If anything happens to us, you do what you think is right." Tae-sun had nodded once. He did not need more than that. The shuttle docked with a soft hiss. The doors opened, and the human delegation stepped into the Concord station for the first time. It was breathtaking. The corridors were vast, high enough to fly through, wide enough to hold rivers. The walls were covered in murals that stretched from floor to ceiling, painted in colors that human eyes struggled to process. Each mural showed a scene, a species kneeling before the Concord banner. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Every shape and size, every kind of life the galaxy had produced, all of them on their knees. Nari stopped in front of one. It showed a species with 4 arms and gentle faces, their heads bowed, their hands open in surrender. There was a date carved beneath it, in Concord script. She ran the numbers in her head. The mural was 9,000 years old. They don't have allies, she whispered to Hana. They have subjects. Hana glanced at the mural. I noticed, she said, and kept walking. They were led into a chamber at the center of the station. It was circular, with a high domed ceiling that showed the stars through transparent panels. A long table sat in the middle, curved like a crescent moon. On one side sat the Concord delegation, 6 figures, tall and pale, dressed in robes that seemed to move on their own. At the center sat High Arbiter Solon, his hands folded, his face as still as carved stone. On the other side of the table, 4 chairs waited, empty, small, clearly designed to make whoever sat in them feel like children at an adult's table. Jinnu walked to his chair and sat down without hesitation. His delegation followed. Nari placed her datapad on the table. Dohyun activated a small translation device. Hana simply sat and stared at Solon with the kind of look that could cut glass. Solon spoke first. His voice filled the room like smoke, translated in real time through the devices on the table. I will educate you, he said, since you are young and clearly do not understand the nature of the galaxy you have entered. He told them the history of the Valith Concord. 12,000 years ago, the Valith had risen to power and united the galaxy under a single principle, order through submission. Every species that was discovered was given the same choice. Join the Concord as a lesser member, accept its laws and its rule, and receive the protection and technology of the oldest civilization in existence, or refuse and be removed. Not conquered, removed, erased from history, their worlds sterilized, their names forgotten. It had happened many times. It would happen again. Every species we have found has made the wise choice, Solon said. He looked at Jinnu the way a teacher looks at a student who has failed to understand a simple lesson. What is your answer, human? The room waited. Jinnu did not answer right away. Instead, he turned to Nari. Doctor, he said. Show them. Nari took a breath. Then she activated her datapad, and a holographic display bloomed above the table, bright, vivid, and full of pain. She showed them Earth. She showed them everything. The first images were beautiful. Blue oceans, green forests, cities of glass and light, children laughing, music playing in crowded streets. But then the images changed. She showed them the wars. World War I, with its trenches and poison gas, and a generation of young men buried in mud. World War II, with its fire and its camps, and its bombs that turned cities into shadows on the ground. She showed them the nuclear tests, the flash, the cloud, the silence afterward. She showed them famine. She showed them plagues. She showed them the great climate collapse of the late 21st century, when the oceans rose and the crops died, and humanity came within a breath of ending itself. The Concord delegation watched. Some of them shifted in their seats. Killith, who stood in the shadows at the edge of the room as a silent observer, could not look away. And then Nari showed them what came after. She showed them the rebuilding, the treaties written on the ashes of dead cities, the first fusion reactors, the first colony ships, the first children born on Mars, on Europa, on Titan. She showed them humanity crawling out of its own grave, bloody and broken and stubborn beyond all reason. reaching for the stars with burned hands, and refusing, absolutely refusing, to die. Nari turned off the display. The room was quiet. Jinnu spoke. His voice was soft, but it filled every corner of that ancient chamber. "You asked what kind of species we are," he said. "We are the kind that nearly destroyed itself. Not once, many times. We have seen the worst of what we can be. We have tasted our own ashes." He paused, "and every time we stood up and said again, 'You built your empire on obedience, on the idea that younger species must kneel because you are older and stronger. But we did not build our ship because we wanted to rule anyone. We built it because we survived ourselves, and that is something you cannot take from us. Not with your fleets, not with your history, not with all 12,000 years of your silence." Solon stared at him. The other Concord delegates stared at him. The air in the room felt heavier, as if the station itself was holding its breath. Solon leaned forward. "You are a young species that has barely left its cradle. You have one ship. One. We have millions. You talk of survival as if it makes you special. It does not. Every species survives until it doesn't." "And yet," Jinnu said, "you are the one who invited us to this table." Solon's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes flickered, a crack in a wall that had never been tested before. The High Arbiter stood. "You have 8 galactic cycles to accept the terms of the Concord. After that, we will act as we have always acted. This meeting is over." He turned and walked out. The doors closed behind them, with a sound like a tomb sealing shut. Hana leaned back in her chair and let out a long breath. "They are going to attack us," she said. Jinnu nodded slowly. "Yes, because they are afraid, because they have never not been in control," Jinnu said. "And they do not know what to do when someone stands in front of them and does not look away." They returned to the shuttle. They returned to the Begdu. Behind them, the station hung in the void, like a monument to a galaxy that had been silent for too long. And in the shadows of that station, Observer Killith sat alone in her quarters with the human data files that Nari had left behind in the chamber's shared system. She had not been supposed to take them. She had taken them anyway. She read for hours. She read about wars and peace and art and music, and a poet who had written about a road not taken, and another who had written about rage against a dying light. She read about a species that had every reason to give up and never did. When she finished, she sat very still in the dark, and for the first time in her 300 years, she allowed herself to think a thought that no Concord citizen was ever supposed to think. What if we were wrong? The deadline came and went like a door closing in a burning house. There was no warning, no final message, no last chance. The Concord had given its terms, and humanity had answered with silence. And now, the silence was over. They came out of the dark like a tide. 400 warships, bright and sharp and singing with energy, dropping out of faster-than-light travel in waves that lit up the void like a second sunrise. They came from every direction, above, below, left, right, forward and behind, filling the space around the Baekdu with a net of silver and light that left no gap, no escape, no room to run. It was the largest military action the Valeth Concord had taken in 3,000 years, and it was aimed at a single ship. On the bridge of the Baekdu, the alarms hit like a scream. Captain Yunhana's hands were already moving, pulling up tactical displays, counting contacts, mapping firing solutions. Her voice cut through the noise like a blade. 412 contacts. All armed, all charging weapons. They are everywhere, Admiral. Lieutenant Kang Dohun gripped his console as the ship shuddered from the gravitational distortion of so many vessels arriving at once. His screens were flooded with signals, targeting locks, formation data, encrypted chatter between Concord ships. They are not hailing us, sir. No demands, no offers, this is it. In the Marine Bay, Sergeant Bay Tayson sealed his helmet and checked his rifle one last time. Around him, 500 men and women in heavy assault armor stood ready in their boarding pods, their faces lit by red emergency lights, their breathing steady and controlled. Tayson opened the squad channel. Listen to me. Whatever comes through those doors, whatever we hit when those pods open, you do not stop. You do not hesitate. You fight like you have something to go home to. Because you do. Every single one of you does. Now get ready. Shinari stood at the back of the bridge, gripping a railing with white knuckles. She was not a soldier. She had never been in combat. But she had refused to leave the bridge when Hana suggested it, and no one had argued with her twice. Admiral Park Jinu stood at the center of it all, his hands at his sides, his eyes moving across the tactical display that floated in the air before him like a map of the end of the world. 400 ships, 1 Titan. The math was simple, the math was impossible, and it did not matter, because Jinu had not come this far to do math. He opened the ship-wide channel. His voice reached every deck, every corridor, every room on the Baekdu. It reached the engine crews deep in the belly of the ship, and the medical teams in the forward bays, and the pilots strapped into their fighters, and the cooks in the galley, who had put down their knives and picked up whatever they could find. This is your admiral, he said. They have age. They have an empire that has lasted longer than our species has been walking upright. But they have never, not once in 12,000 years, met anything like us. His voice did not shake. It did not rise. It was steady and warm and impossibly calm, like a father talking to his children before a storm. Show them what humanity is. All hands, weapons free. The Baekdu opened fire. It was not graceful. It was not elegant. It was the concentrated fury of a species that had been born in fire and had never quite stopped burning. Railgun batteries along the Titan's spine fired in synchronized volleys, sending streams of tungsten rounds the size of cars across the void at fractions of light speed. Plasma lances, long, terrible beams of superheated matter, cut through the dark like the fingers of an angry god. Missile swarms poured from the ship's flanks in waves, each one carrying a warhead designed to crack armor that humanity had never even seen until 3 days ago. And then the main weapon fired. The Singularity Lance sat at the heart of the Baekdu like a caged star. It was humanity's greatest and most terrible creation, a focused beam of compressed gravitational force, a weapon that bent space itself into a razor and swung it. When it fired, there was no flash, no sound. Just a ripple in the void, a shimmering line that moved faster than the eye could follow, and then 6 Concorde warships, 6, in a line, one behind the other, folded inward. They did not explode. They collapsed. They twisted and crushed and became nothing, pulled into themselves like paper crumpled by an invisible hand. And then they were gone. The void where they had been was empty. On the Concorde flagship, Solon watched 6 of his ships disappear from existence in less than a second. His officers were shouting. His tactical display was a chaos of red and orange. Warnings screamed from every console. He stood perfectly still, his face carved from stone, and for the first time in 400 years, his hands were trembling. All ships, he said. Focus fire. Destroy it. The Concorde fleet responded. Hundreds of beams converged on the Baekdu, a storm of light and energy that turned the space around the Titan into a burning hell. The shields flared, bright, blinding, pushing back against forces that would have turned a planet to glass. On the bridge, the lights went red, the floor shook, power relays screamed. Hana's fingers danced across her console, rerouting energy, shifting shield geometry, feeding power from non-essential systems into the barriers that were the only thing between the crew and death. "Shields at 62%, she called out. "They are hitting hard." "Then hit them harder," Jinnu said. "Not backward. Not sideways. Forward, into the teeth of the Concorde fleet, firing with everything it had." Tayson's Marines launched, boarding pods shooting from the Titan's belly like seeds from a dying tree, crossing the void in seconds and slamming into the hulls of damaged Concorde ships. Airlock doors were blown open. Marines poured inside, fighting hand-to-hand in corridors that were not built for their size. Their armor too heavy, their weapons too loud, their fury too big for the elegant spaces of the Concorde warships. They fought like cornered animals, because that is what they were, the children of a planet that had tried to kill them 1,000 times, and then failed every single time. Observer Killith watched from the flagship's observation deck. She was supposed to be recording. She was supposed to be clinical, detached, scientific. Instead, she was standing with her hands pressed against the glass, watching a single ship tear through an Empire's fleet like a wounded animal that had decided dying was not an option. The Concorde ships were not weaker. Their technology was older, more refined, and in many ways more advanced. But they fought the way they had always fought, with precision, with formation, with the calm certainty that numbers and order would always win. They had never fought something that did not follow the rules. They had never fought something that charged into the fire instead of away from it. They had never fought humans. And then, in the middle of the battle, with shields failing and hull breaches venting atmosphere into the void, and the smell of burning metal filling every corridor, Admiral Park Jinnu did something that no military mind in the galaxy would have predicted. He stopped fighting. Not the ship. The ship kept firing. But Jinnu turned to Do-hyun and said, "Open a channel. Not to the Concorde fleet. To everyone. Every frequency, every band, every listening post in the galaxy. I want every living thing that has ears to hear this." Do-hyun looked at him with wide eyes. Then he did it. The channel opened, and Jinnu spoke. "This is Admiral Park Jinnu of the human warship Baekdu. We did not come here to conquer. We did not come to kneel. We came because we exist, and that is enough." His voice was broadcast across the stars, carried by every relay and every satellite and every signal that the Concorde had spent millennia building. To every species listening, you do not have to kneel either. The words went out. They crossed light years in moments. They reached worlds that had not heard a free voice in thousands of years. They reached beings who had been born into submission and had never imagined anything else. They reached the quiet corners of the galaxy where hope had gone to die. On the Concorde flagship, captains who had served the Arbiter for centuries looked at each other and for the first time hesitated. Solon gave the order for a second wave. Some ships moved forward, others did not. The formation broke. The perfect machine of the Concorde warfleet stuttered like a heart skipping a beat. And on a private channel, hidden in the noise of battle, a single transmission reached the Baekdu. It came from the Concorde flagship. It was one word, sent in broken, imperfect human language that had been learned in secret from stolen files. Enough. Do-hyun stared at the screen. He turned to Jinnu. His voice was barely a whisper. "Sir, I think someone on their side just blinked." Jinnu looked at the message. He looked at the burning void outside the window, the wreckage of ships and the fading light of weapons fire, and the slow, uncertain retreat of an empire that had never retreated before. He allowed himself one small breath. Then he said, "Good. Now let's finish this." The Baekdu was dying slowly. Not all at once, not in a flash or an explosion, or a sudden clean ending. It was dying the way old soldiers die, one wound at a time, still standing, still breathing, still refusing to fall, even when every part of the body screamed for rest. 12 hull breaches bled atmosphere into the void. 3 of the starboard railgun batteries were silent, their barrels melted into twisted shapes. The portside armor had been peeled back in places, exposing the bones of the ship to the cold stars. Emergency lights painted the corridors in red. Medics moved through the lower decks carrying the wounded on stretchers, stepping over debris, working in silence because there was nothing to say that the work did not already say for them. But the engines still hummed. The Singularity Lance, deep in the Titan's core, still pulsed with a slow and patient heartbeat, ready to fire again if anyone was foolish enough to ask for more. The Concorde fleet had pulled back. Not all of it. Some ships had been too damaged to move, and drifted in the void like broken teeth. Others had retreated on their own, their captains making decisions that Salon had not authorized and would not forgive. The perfect cage that had surrounded the Baekdu was gone, replaced by a scattered, uncertain ring of ships that kept their distance like wolves that had bitten something and found it harder than expected. Salon stood on his flagship and stared at the wreckage. 87 ships lost. 87. He had never lost a single vessel in a first contact action. He had never needed to. In 12,000 years, the Concorde had perfected the art of making lesser species understand their place, and it had always worked. Until now. The calls came within hours, not from the humans, from his own people. Concorde member species, ambassadors and governors and military leaders, flooding his channels with demands for explanation. They had all seen the battle. They had all heard the broadcast, a single voice saying a single thing that the Concorde had spent millennia making sure no one ever said. You do not have to kneel. Salon was not afraid of the humans. He was afraid of what the humans had started. The negotiations happened quickly, not because either side wanted to rush, but because the galaxy was moving too fast to wait. Cracks were forming in the Concorde. Species that had been silent for centuries were talking to each other. Diplomatic channels that had been dead for thousands of years were suddenly alive with chatter. Something had changed in the fabric of the galaxy, and everyone could feel it, like the first tremor before an earthquake. On the Baekdu, Admiral Park Jinu received a visitor he had not expected. Observer Killith arrived alone, in a small shuttle, broadcasting a white signal, the Concorde's equivalent of a flag of truce. She docked without incident, and when she stepped onto the Baekdu's hangar deck, she found Captain Yoon Hana waiting for her, with 4 armed Marines, and a look that could freeze plasma. I am not here to fight, Killith said. Her voice was soft and careful, each word in the human language, chosen with the precision of someone who had taught herself from stolen files, and practiced alone in the dark. Hana studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded and led her to the bridge. Jinu was there, standing at his usual place by the forward window, his hands behind his back. He looked tired. There were shadows under his eyes that had not been there a week ago. But his back was straight and his gaze was steady. And when he turned to face the alien who had crossed the void to meet him, he showed her the same respect he would show any officer who had walked through fire to be somewhere. Kylith bowed, not the deep submissive bow that the Concorde demanded of lesser species, but a small, careful nod that was entirely her own. I have come to offer myself as a liaison, she said, between your species and the ones who are listening. Jinu tilted his head. Listening? Your broadcast, Admiral. Half the galaxy heard it. Species that have been under Concorde rule for thousands of years. They heard your voice. And now they are reaching out. To each other, to us, to you. She paused. You did not defeat the Concorde with your weapons. You wounded it, yes. But it was your words that broke something. Something that has been holding this galaxy in place for 12,000 years. Fear. Dr. Shin Nari, who had been standing nearby listening, stepped forward. What do they think of us? She asked. The other species, what do they say? Killeth looked at her with those wide silver eyes that had seen centuries of silence, and were only now learning what sound looked like. "They think you are insane," she said simply. "One ship, one species, standing against the largest fleet in the galaxy, and refusing to move." The corner of her mouth moved in something that was almost a smile. "And they think maybe that is what the galaxy needed." Nari laughed. It was a small, exhausted, beautiful laugh, the kind that only came out when the body had run out of every other response, and joy was the only thing left. Genu met with Salon one final time. It happened on the same station as before, in the same room with the same murals of kneeling species on the walls. But the room felt different now. The murals felt different. They did not look like trophies anymore. They looked like evidence. Solon sat across from Genu, with a face that betrayed nothing. He was still the High Arbiter. He still held power. But the kind of power he held had changed, and both of them knew it. "What do you want, human?" Solon asked. His voice was colder than before, but beneath the cold there was something new, a weariness, an exhaustion that came not from the body, but from the soul. "Territory? Power? A seat on the Concorde?" Genu shook his head slowly. "We want a chair at the table," he said. "Not above anyone, not below. A chair. That is all it ever was." The silence in the room stretched like a wire pulled tight, vibrating with the weight of everything that had happened, and everything that was about to happen next. Then, slowly, the High Arbiter of the Valith Concord did something that had not been done in recorded history. He stood in the presence of a younger species, not in submission, not in defeat, but in recognition, in the simple, ancient, powerful act of acknowledging that the creature sitting across from him was not a child, not a subject, not a lesser thing to be guided or crushed, but an equal, a real, stubborn, impossible equal. Genu stood too. He extended his hand. Solon looked at it for a long moment, as if trying to understand what it meant. Then carefully he took it. Back on the Baekdu, the crew gathered, not in formation, not in ranks, but in the messy, exhausted, beautiful way that people gather after they have been through something that words cannot hold. Hana leaned against a railing on the observation deck, her arms crossed, her eyes closed, feeling the hum of the ship through her bones. Taesun sat on the floor with his back against the wall, a medic wrapping a bandage around a gash on his forearm, while he grinned at nothing and everything. Dohyun was already at his console, cataloging new signals, alien languages he had never heard before, pouring in from across the galaxy, like letters from strangers who had just learned they were not alone. Nari sat with Killeth on the observation deck, both of them looking out at the stars. They did not speak for a long time. Then Nari said, "Do you think this will last? The change?" Killeth thought about it. "I do not know," she said. "Change is difficult. The Concorde is old. Old things do not break easily." She paused. "But old things do break. And what your admiral said, what your species showed, that does not go back into the dark once it has come into the light." Nari nodded and wiped her eyes. Genu stood alone on the bridge. The stars filled the window. The comboard was alive with lights. Dozens of new signals, hails, tentative greetings from species that had been silent for centuries. Some were curious. Some were afraid. Some were hopeful, in a way that felt fragile, like something that had been buried for so long it had forgotten what the sun looked like. He placed his hand on the hull of the ship. He felt the vibration of the engines. Wounded, patched, running rough, but running, still running. Like everything human, the Baekdu did not stop just because it was hurt. It kept going, because that was the only thing it knew how to do. "We are not alone anymore," he said quietly, to no one and everyone. And across the galaxy, on worlds with no names in any human language, beings of every shape and size and color looked up at the stars. They whispered the name of a ship, Baekdu, and the name of a species that had come from nothing, built from ashes, armed with stubbornness and fire, and stood before the oldest power in the universe, and said the simplest, most dangerous thing any living creature could say. "We are here. Deal with it." The galaxy had watched in silence. And then, slowly, star by star, world by world, voice by voice,